Okay. So without waiting too much, we're going to get started. I know you guys are on a lunch break probably. We don't want to wait too long for others to join in. We have enough people already here, so we can get started. My name is Bibhas Bhattacharya. I work for Web-based Solutions, and these days I'm doing a lot of consulting and training with Angular 5 mostly. And I also do mobile development with iOS and Android. So today's agenda is going to be at a very high level. We're going to talk about a few advanced topics in Angular, and we're going to end the presentation talking about what are the cool and exciting features in Angular 6. All right, so let's take a look at the agenda. We're going to go over how to lazy load modules, why we need to lazy load modules, what are the benefits and how to pull it off. And we're going to discuss how to use third-party tools like Bootstrap with Angular. Bootstrap is a very popular front-end toolkit. We're going to learn how to use it with Angular. And we're going to learn about the RxJS subject API. And when we're going to learn when to use it. There are some scenarios where the subject API can make our life a lot easier. Basically, we'll be doing publish and subscribe using this API. And of course, we're going to end the presentation talking about what's new in Angular 6. So during this presentation, feel free to ask me any question. There is a questions pane in GoToWebinar. Feel free to ask me a question, or you can just raise your hand, and I will try to keep an eye out, see if you have raised any hands. If I miss it, please I apologize beforehand because I'm sometimes too busy talking and I don't pay attention to who is raising hands, but you can definitely ask me the question at the very end when I'm going to pause the presentation and look for questions from you. Okay. First thing we're going to discuss is lazy loading modules. So let's see how module loading works by default. Again, I'm hoping that you guys know about modules. So just a brief background. You could develop your entire application using just one module. So every Angular application has to have the app module or the root module. And you need to have that at minimum. And you can, a small to medium sized application can be built using just the app module. But as your application grows in size, you may want to break it up in multiple feature modules. So in this example, you can see there are 3 feature modules for an e-commerce website, such as Amazon and Macy's and some kind of a retail website. And we have broken up our application in 3 feature modules. One of them is catalog module. So there we have product browsing. So you can browse through your products and categories. You can search for products and things like that. All of those components and services are in the catalog module. Then we have 2 other modules. One is the checkout module, where you might be checking out, you entering your billing address, shipping address, and so on, and paying for your purchase. We also have another feature module called account module, where you can go maintain your address book. You can look at your past orders and things like that. So all of these 3 feature modules are members of the app module. So the app module includes these 3 feature modules. So if you want to work like that, then you have to import these feature modules, like I'm doing on the right-hand side. I'm importing these feature modules from the app module. Okay, that's the way things are normally done. And when you do things like that, all your feature module code and assets like CSS, images, and things like that will be eagerly loaded by the browser. What that means is that when the user first comes to your application, when the user first accesses your application in the browser, the assets and your JavaScript code for all of these feature modules are going to be loaded up front. Okay, So that's called eager loading, and that's the default behavior in Angular. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. It works very well. But what you can do is you can improve the experience of the user a little bit, especially when you have very large feature modules. Like in this case, we have the checkout module and account module, and these modules are probably not used by most users. Most users just browse through your products and things like that. So what we can do is we can lazily load some of these feature modules like checkout module and account module, so that your application loads faster when the user first comes to your website. All right, so you can speed up the initial load of the application by lazily loading some of the feature modules and not loading them up front. So this is very easy to do in Angular. So at a very high level, what you're going to do is notice on the right-hand side. So our objective here is that we're still going to load the catalog module eagerly. So this will be loaded as soon as the user comes to your website, because we think that catalog module is used by most users. On the other hand, checkout module and account modules are infrequently used, so we're going to load them lazily. So you see that on the right-hand side, when your app module is importing the feature modules, we are only importing catalog module, because that's the way to do eager loading, okay? So we're going to keep doing that for catalog module, but you see checkout module and account modules are missing here, because we intend to load them asynchronously. So these modules will be loaded asynchronously when the user first navigates to any component within these modules. All right, so for example, let's say the checkout module has a component called shipping address. So once the user navigates to the shipping address component using routing, that's the first time the code and assets for checkout module will be loaded asynchronously by the browser. And once the module is loaded, it stays loaded. There is no way to unload it at this point. Same thing when the user first navigates to a component within the account module's code and assets will be loaded asynchronously. All right, so what you need to do is, because the app module is not directly importing checkout module and account module, what you have to do is you need to link to these modules. The way to do the linking is in the next slide. So in your application's route table, we still have, for a catalog component, which is from the catalog module, we just do a regular routing. So the path browse is mapped to the catalog component, and this is an eagerly loaded module. But for the checkout module and account module, what we do is that we set up a route for the entire module. So we use the path checkout that points to the checkout module. So this is a path that does not point to any component, but it's pointing to a module, a feature module. Similarly, the account path is pointing to the account module, okay? So we're not directly referring to the module or any component in the module using a class name. We are using a string here that is pointing to the feature module. So once you code like that, what's going to happen is that when you build your application using ng-build, it's going to create a JavaScript file for the main application. It's going to create two other JavaScript files, one each for the checkout module and for the account module. So this checkout module and account module is going to get its own separate JavaScript file after you do the build. And these JavaScript files will be dynamically loaded by the browser. So make sure this is something we get into this in more details. Of course, we have labs, and in the lecture, we spend a little bit more time on this. So one thing, just to as a caveat, make sure that the class names of the components in these modules don't appear anywhere here. So it's not going to look anything like catalog component. I'm using a class name here. And because this is eagerly loaded, I can use the class name. So make sure the class names are not appearing anywhere here, because if you even if you have an import statement on top, this might confuse the build system, and build system may not produce separate JavaScript files for these modules. Okay, so just follow this pattern, and it will be okay. So one last thing we need to know about lazy loading is how to link to any component in the lazily loaded modules. So as you know that we build links to components in Angular using the router link attribute directive. So the browse path is pointing to the eagerly loaded catalog component. So because we're using the path browse, so that's a normal standard link to the browse component. However, for the components that are in the lazily loaded modules, notice what we are doing here. We are prefixing the link with the path for the module. So if I go back, notice once again that our checkout module has a path of checkout, account module has a path of account, and we need to prefix the paths with the module path. All right. So that's the way we build links into a lazily loaded module. And once the user clicks on any of these links, the module will be loaded. And you can see it in your browser's developer tool that it's actually requesting to load the JavaScript for the module asynchronously. All right, so it's pretty easy to do, and you should give it a shot if you are working on a fairly large application. All right, so we're going to move on. We're going to go to the publish subscribe pattern in Angular application. So let's first understand the problem. The problem has to do with inter-component communication. So let's take a look at the right-hand side in this image. We have a parent component for the whole page. This is that blue background box. And the parent component has 3 child components, A, B, and C. So it's very common actually, as soon as your application, or if you're working on a medium to large scale complicated application, and I work with a lot of clients, and this is a very common pattern that appears where these sibling components, A, B, and C are siblings, they need to communicate with each other. They need to somehow communicate with each other. For example, B might be showing a button that says add to cart. So when I add the item to the cart, A might be a shopping cart component. It needs to update the component to show the item I just added to the cart. All right, so A and B are both sibling components, but when an action happens in B, A needs to update its internal state and display. So similarly, it goes from there. Multiple different components that are all siblings need to communicate with each other. So how to do this? This can be done using Angular's data binding. So data binding is the official way of implementing this, and definitely it can be done. So the way this will happen is that let's say that some action happens in child A, and child A needs to communicate with child B and C. So it needs to pass some kind of a notification that some state has changed or some event has occurred in A. It needs to communicate that to B and C. How are we going to do that? Using traditional Angular, using just data binding. So the way to do that is to use the parent component as the conduit for this communication, as the pipeline for this communication. So you have to go through the parent component. What child component A has to do is raise an event, and to raise the event, we use the output properties. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of how to do this. We covered this in our course, but anytime a component needs to raise an event to its parent, it needs to use this adds an output attribute. So the child is raising an event, and the parent has to listen for this event. The parent has to associate an event handler for this output. So the parent component gets to find out that there is some kind of an action that has taken place in A, and you can do data binding using this. So the parent's internal state gets updated automatically, and then you need to bind to child B and C using input. All right. So because of data binding, then the data change will propagate from the child to the parent first, and this change will then propagate to child B and C. And this is how the data binding works in Angular. And you can use two-way data binding. We can also simplify it using one-way data binding. If the directionality is like this, if the child B never reports back to the parent, you can just use a single unidirectional data binding. It's up to you. But the bottom line is that this data binding has to flow through from child A to the parent and from parent to B and C. This works, nothing wrong with that. Problem is that when you have many components, so there are many different types of communications happening, the parent component starts to become more and more complicated because it has to do a lot of data binding to all its children. And it soon becomes fairly complicated. So let's see how we can solve this problem using publish and subscribe. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to set up a subject. A subject is we have to create an instance of a subject. And so this is our subject here. And child A, a component A can simply publish some kind of a data, some kind of a payload. It can be anything using subject.next method call. So in this case, we are supplying a payload of hello, but it could be any JavaScript object. So we are publishing it this way, and what the other components doing is that they are subscribing to the same subject instance. So they're going to call subject.subscribe, and they will be notified anytime child A publishes any kind of data. And the only thing you have to watch out for is that these children components are all working with the same instance of the subject. So you probably want to store this subject within a service, because services are by default singletons. So you want to wrap the subject into an Angular service, and all of these components are going to inject the same service instance, so that then we can one component can publish using subject.next, and other components can simply subscribe to that subject. So using the publish and subscribe, your parent component becomes super simple then, because you don't have to do data binding, and the entire code base becomes much simpler. So this is the way multiple components in the same page can communicate with each other without having to go through the parent component. Okay, we're going to move on to using Bootstrap, how to use Bootstrap from Angular. So there are two different NPM packages we need to know about. Excuse me. So as you know, Bootstrap does two things. It gives you a layout engine to do responsive layout of your application. So it has a layout engine. It also has a set of widgets like buttons and navigation bar and menus and things like that, pop-up dialogues and things like that. So it does both. So the layout engine is done entirely using CSS, whereas the widgets like pop-ups and buttons and so on, they require JavaScript. And by default, Bootstrap uses jQuery to implement these widgets. So there are two NPM packages we need to learn about. First one is the Bootstrap NPM package. This gives us just the CSS. So we're going to need that for layout. So we need to install that. There is another NPM package. This is NPM package, ng Bootstrap. What this is the Angular port or Angular version of the Bootstrap widgets, like tooltip, pagination, pop-up dialogues, and things like that. Again, so by default, these widgets are implemented using jQuery, but this project, ng Bootstrap project, ports them over to Angular. So they are implemented like Angular components or directives, right? So depending on what you want to use, if you're just going to be using the CSS layout, all you have to do is install the Bootstrap project in your Angular application. But if you intend to use the widgets as well, you need to install the second package in your Angular application. So let's see first how to use the Angular CSS, assuming you have installed the Bootstrap package in your application. You have done this, assuming you have installed the Bootstrap package. And then what you have to do is you got to open your application styles.css. Every application generated by Angular CLI has a styles.css file. And from within the file, you have to import the Bootstrap CSS file. You just add that line to our styles.css. Once you do that, something interesting happens. When you do an ng build, it's going to inline, it's going to take the contents of bootstrap.min.css, it's going to take the entire content of the file, and it's going to inline that in your index.html, in your application's index.html. It's going to add a style tag, and within the style tag, it's going to add the entire contents of the bootstrap.min.css. So this is called inlining. All right, so it's not going to, so the browser is not going to download the Bootstrap CSS separately. The entire content of the CSS is now embedded inside index.html. So we call that inlining. And so because we're doing inlining, there is an advantage to this, that the browser doesn't have to download the CSS file separately. What that means is that your page is going to load faster and it's going to render faster. So as soon as the index.html is downloaded, the entire CSS is also downloaded, so the page is going to load and render faster. So that's what you get by approaching things this way, by bringing in the Bootstrap CSS file this way. Alternatively, what you can do, this is possible, I just wanted to discuss this, not that it's recommended or anything. What you can do is that you can simply, go to your index.html file, you can simply add a regular style sheet link tag and get the Bootstrap file, Bootstrap CSS file from a CDN. CDN is a content delivery network, so there are several CDNs that host the Bootstrap file. You can directly get the file from there. And one advantage of this is that if you do this way, then you don't have to install the Bootstrap npm package. Okay, you're just not installing it locally, you're just getting it directly from the CDN. But this is going to load a bit slower than the original approach I talked about. Okay, so once you have loaded in the CSS, either using either one of these two approaches, you can start using it like from anywhere, from any component HTML template. You can start to use these classes. There are well-known Bootstrap classes like container, row, colMD, and things like that. So in this case, I'm using it in the app component HTML, which is the root component in any application. And within that, I'm having my router outlet. So all of the other child components are going to be embedded here in this area. Okay. Okay, so let's say that you want to use the Bootstrap widgets like tooltip and pagination and so on. So again, assuming you have installed the ng Bootstrap npm package, you can then go and open your application module file. In the application module file, you have to import the ngB module. ngB stands for ng Bootstrap. So ngB module is where all our Bootstrap widgets are available from. So they're implemented as directives and components. So they're all available from ngB module. And we have to make sure that we import ngB module for root from our application module. So once you do that, then you can start to use any of these widgets in your application. So let's see an example of this. Let's say you want to show a tooltip for a button. So we have a button here. you want to show a tooltip, you use these directives, ngb tooltip and placement. So these are all directives that are coming from the ngb module, and you can just very easily start to show these tooltips and things like that. So that documentation will tell you how to use the rest of the widgets like pagination or pop-up dialogues and things like that. Bootstrap is not the only game in town. There are a couple of other frameworks I wanted to talk to you about. There is one, these are all open source projects. One is called Bulma. Bulma is a purely a responsive layout framework. It does not come with any widgets, so it's a completely JavaScript free framework. And it's, so one of you have a question. Let me see what the question is. So the question is, are you going to share the slides? Yes, so we're going to share the slide. Actually, let me go ahead and do this right now. Well, I still remember this. All right, so I'm uploading the slides in the handout section, so you can download the PDF from there. Okay, so yeah, I was talking about the Bulma framework. This is a purely responsive layout framework. It doesn't have any JavaScript. It doesn't have any widgets or anything like that. So one cool thing about Bulma is that unlike Bootstrap, it uses this new technology called CSS Flexbox. So this is a new technology, and it's available in most browsers today. And using the CSS Flexbox, we can do all kinds of nifty complicated layout fairly easily in your application. So Bulma makes the one problem with the CSS Flexbox layout is that it does not address the responsive nature. So the responsive nature comes from Bulma, so that your application lays out differently in a desktop browser versus a mobile browser. So Bulma is a very thin wrapper over the CSS Flexbox technology, and the thing it provides you is its the ability to make your application responsive. Then we have the Clarity project. It's a project that's made available from VMware. So Clarity is very much like Bootstrap. It's very much of an equivalent to Bootstrap. It gives us both layout, responsive layout, as well as widgets. So one thing about these widgets is that they are natively implemented as Angular, whereas for Bootstrap, the native implementation is jQuery, and a separate project, ng Bootstrap, ports them over to Angular. Okay. Whereas for Clarity, the widgets are by default natively implemented as Angular directives and components. So the website is over there. You can use that. So these are all, these projects are available to us to very quickly lay out your application, use fairly nice looking widgets in your application. And then we are going to cover Angular Material. Angular Material is like Angular, it's a project that's funded by Google. So Material is a design framework, design language. What that means is that it talks about the color scheme, it talks about font size, it goes into the details about how to render a button, what kind of animation one is to present. So the specification goes into the nitty-gritty details about the button size, the font size, and things like that. And there are many implementation of the specification. So for example, Android operating system follows Material by default. Now, if you are building an Angular, if you're building an Android application, by default, all the Android widgets will follow Material specification. On the website, if you are building a website and you would like to follow the Material specification, then you can use these Angular Material widgets. And this widget library follows the specification very closely. Now, one problem with the Angular Material is that it's a widget-only framework. It doesn't have any layout capabilities. It doesn't have any layout engine. So when it comes to the layout, you could use Bootstrap and just to do the layout, or you can use a framework like Bulma to do the layout for your application. We have another question. Let me see what the question is. Yes, Joseph, go ahead and, okay, let me see. Can you use a combination of alternatives with Bootstrap, or would you, okay, yeah, that I just answered that question. So you could use Bootstrap just for layout, and you don't have to use the Bootstrap widgets. That's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And in that case, you could use Angular material for the widgets. Yeah, that's perfectly okay. All right, so that completes the Angular 5 section of the presentation. We're going to now we have a few slides on Angular 6. What's new in Angular 6? So Angular 6 release has been, we're expecting that any day now, and it's a little bit delayed at this point. So it should come out anytime. So release candidate 6 is out there right now. So we are expecting, based on past behavior, maybe up to release candidate 10 will be out there before Angular 6 comes out. So that means maybe another few weeks from now before Angular 6 comes out. These are all just guesswork. Nobody really knows when Angular 6 is going to come out, but it's overdue. They have been sliding the release date. Okay, so let's take a look at what are some of the cool and interesting features. Of course, there's a ton of new features, but a lot of it is behind the scene. We don't need to really worry about all that, but some of the stuff we need to know about. So let's take a look. First, we're going to take a look at the CLI changes. So we have a couple of new commands. ng update is new. What ng update is going to do for you is that it's going to update your package.json file, and it's going to, okay, we have another question. Sure, Rajesh, go ahead and type in your question. I'm going to also unmute you so you can speak into the microphone. It's up to you. You can type in your question, or you can just speak into the microphone. Hello, Rajesh. Okay, I'm going to proceed because I'm not hearing from you. Feel free to ask me a detailed question in the questions pane, and then I'll answer your question. All right, so we're talking about ng update. What ng update does is it will update your dependencies. It will bring your dependencies up to the latest available version. So, which also means once Angular 6 comes out, once it's fully released, all you have to do is go to your application's root folder and run ng update, and it's going to upgrade your application from Angular 5 to 6. All right, so the upgrade path becomes super simple. And of course, you have to make sure your application compiles, and you have to go through for proper formal testing to make sure that Angular 6 did not break anything. But the upgrade process itself is fairly simple. You have to run ng update from your application root, and a few months later, if you want to bring in more up-to-date packages, you can run ng update again. So every few months, you might like to run ng update, and it's going to bring up the dependencies version. So one cool thing about ng update is that, of course, it knows about Angular itself, but it also knows about other projects like Angular Material, like I talked about, like Bootstrap. So these are some of the popular projects. Angular Update knows about them. So if you are using those third-party modules in your application, and ng Update is going to go ahead and update those as well. Okay. So next we take a look at the ng add command. What ng add does is that once you have created your application using ng new, you can run ng add to add additional features to your application. For example, if you choose to use Angular Material, then you can run ng add with the Angular Material package. And it's going to do a whole bunch of things. Like it's going to first of all, update your package.json file and add all the required packages there. And it's going to also do whatever basic coding you need to do. It's going to generate some code. For example, it's going to import the Angular material module from your app module. It's going to do all that so you can get started right away. Okay, so some of the basic boilerplate code is going to go ahead and add for you. So using ng-add, then you can add support for Angular material. You can add support for Bootstrap, Clarity, and things like that. So right up front, it's going to have support for a couple of these third-party modules. And in future, this support is going to keep growing. Okay, so that's really cool. So internally, what Angular CLI now has done is added support for schematics. What the schematics does is that it allows third parties to add plugins to Angular CLI. So by default, as you know, that you can use Angular CLI to generate components, services, directives, and so on. And from now on, you're not going to be just limited to generating those classes only. Using Angular schematics, third parties can add plugins that allow you to generate additional types of assets. All right, so we'll see how this works out. What kind of new schematics are created, we'll find out later on. Okay, the build system, when you run ng-build in Angular 5, ng-build delegates most of the work to Webpack. Most of the heavy lifting is done by Webpack. So we are seeing in Angular 6, Webpack is going to be replaced by Basel and Clojure. These are the two build systems that are actually used heavily within Google. So tools like Gmail, Google Maps, and so on, they use Basel and Clojure quite a bit. So what Angular team decided to do is decided to go with these tools rather than Webpack. Even though Webpack was very good, ng-build worked very well, nothing wrong with that. It was super easy to use, and the amount of work Webpack did behind the scene was amazing in terms of shaking down the tree and creating a very minimal set of output files. So what Angular team has done in Angular 6 is that they wanted to go one step further. They wanted to create even smaller output code, more efficient output code, and make the build process even faster. To achieve that, they decided to not use Webpack anymore and decided to go with Basel and Clojure. On the other hand, there is a third tool called Ivy. Ivy is a tool, it's called renderer. So what a renderer does in Angular is that it compiles your templates into JavaScript. Okay? Your component templates are eventually converted to JavaScript, and that's called rendering. And they are now using a new next generation renderer. It's called Ivy. So then the net of this is that the net result of all of this is that your built code is going to be smaller, and it's going to be more efficient, more optimized code, and also the build process is speeded up quite a bit. All right, so we're going to see these changes. And our final slide here. This is called Angular Elements. So let's understand what this is all about. So before I talk about Angular Elements, we need to talk about another technology called Web Components. Some of you may know about this. This is a very powerful but emerging standard from W3C. Web Components is a standard that many browsers support already today. This is a standard way to build reusable components for the web. Until this point, we didn't have any standard. So you built components using AngularJS, using Angular, using React. Every framework, jQuery, they all had their own way of building components. All right, so we saw a lot of reinventing the wheel. If you had a grid component done in jQuery, you couldn't use that easily in Angular. So we had to kind of redo the whole thing. Same thing, AngularJS did not port over to Angular very well, and so on. So this is not very good use of our time. We'd like to build one component, whether it's some kind of a drop-down menu or a pop-up dialog. We would like to build once and use it anywhere. That's not the case. For almost 10 years, we've been just reinventing the wheel. So web component is a solution to this huge problem. Using web component, it's now baked into the browser, and I have actually done some development. It's extremely well thought out, and it's very easy and very powerful. If you have programmed using Visual Basic back in the old days, it's very similar to this. So you can start to use reusable components very quickly in your web application. In many cases, you don't need to even write any code. That's one of the beauty of web component. Even when you compare this to Angular, most of these components could be developed and reused without writing any code at all, just using HTML. So it's a very beautiful standard that's emerging. And if you want to get started with this today, there is a framework called Polymer. Polymer is a framework that lets you start creating these web components. It also has a polyfill, so if you are going to be using web components in a browser that doesn't support web component, Polymer project fills in the missing pieces. All right, so that's all about web components I wanted to talk about. What Angular Element lets you do is it lets you package your Angular component as a web component. All right, so basically you're going to be, you can just wrap your Angular component into a web component. So in that case, from any other project, you could be working on a React project or a Vue project or even a jQuery project, you could start using this Angular component without having to worry about the Angular runtime. All right, so, and you could very easily consume or reuse your Angular component in a non-Angular application, such as a jQuery application or React application. So it's a very powerful concept, and if I can just look at the crystal ball, I think what's going to happen is maybe in Angular 7, this Angular is going to natively output web components. So the nature of the Angular component itself will become a web component. So there will be no separation between an Angular component and a web component, because that totally makes sense. So once you do that, then you'll be able to simply use Angular component anywhere. We're not there yet. What we have right now in Angular 6 is the ability to package an Angular component as a web component. So a little bit of code, maybe I have looked at some of this code, and it's maybe 5 or 6 lines of extra code you got to write to convert your Angular component to a web component. And once you do that, the advantage is you can start using your Angular component from React, Vue, and jQuery, and so forth. All right, so just briefly talk about what we are doing, what we're up to. We have a course out there. The outline is out there, and you can just click on the link in your PDF to go there. And this is our comprehensive 5-day-long Angular 6 programming course. So of course, we are porting our course from Angular 5 to 6 following all the best practices, not just a blind port. We also have taken the opportunity to add a few new chapters there that we did not have in Angular 5, such as advanced directive development. You're going to learn to develop structural directives and attribute directives. There will be corresponding labs to go with that. We're also adding labs on Material and Bootstrap Toolkit, like things we talked about, how to style your application using Material and Bootstrap. And the whole thing is going to run on Angular 6. I'm going to send you my email address is bibhas2@gmail.com. You can ask me any questions there. Okay, so that concludes this presentation. Thank you once again for taking the time to join us for this webinar. Hopefully it was useful, and I'm just going to stick around here to answer any question that you might have. And again, please ask a question through the questions pane, and I'll be here for another 5 or 10 minutes to answer your question. Thank you again. Yes, Brajesh, ask me the question. Please ask me a detailed question. I'm going to unmute you so you can speak into the microphone also. So I'm not sure what your question is. I'm just going to go back to the slide and just talk about it a little bit more. So to publish to the subject, you just call subject.next, and it takes in as argument the payload that you are publishing. To subscribe, you subscribe to a subject just like you subscribe an observable. The API is exactly the same. So you call the subject instance dot subscribe, and you supply a arrow function there that's going to receive the payload. So the subscription part is similar to the observable. Amit, the PDF is in the handout section. So look at your handouts pane in GoToWebinar, and you'll see the PDF is uploaded there. Okay, since we have no more questions, I'm going to end this webinar. Thank you once again so much for coming and joining our webinar. Hope to see you again.